Look at that. With minimal effort, with no stand mixer, you can make this bread. Now that you have all my tips, it's time to make the easiest bread recipe, a no-knead bread. In this video, we're going to be using all the tips that I gave you just to demonstrate how they work and what a beautiful bread you can make out of it. In one of my first tip videos, I told you about blooming the yeast to make sure that it's alive and not to kill it with water that's too hot. So that's what we're going to do right now. First, I'm going to test the temperature of the water before I add the yeast in. Okay, it's at 105 degrees Fahrenheit, which is perfect. Now I'm going to add the dry yeast in with a little bit of sugar. That measurement doesn't matter. You're just feeding the sugar, and I'm going to let it sit for 10 minutes. And that was 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast, which is 7 grams of yeast by weight. So this is 1 3/4 cups of water with 2 1/4 teaspoons of active dry yeast and a little bit of sugar. While that's blooming, I'm gonna measure out my flour. I like to weigh it, but if you're using cups, it's 4 cups, spoon, and level. And if you're using grams, it's 530 grams of flour. I'm using bread flour for this recipe. You could also use AP flour, but bread flour gives you a better chew and a nicer crust. Now I'm going to add in the salt for this recipe. So what I talked about in the previous video is that every 500 grams of flour needs 10 grams of salt. So since this is 530 grams, I'm going to do like 11 or 12 grams of salt, which is like a teaspoon and 3/4 maybe. What I like to do is mix the salt in with the flour. I know a lot of people say salt touching the yeast doesn't matter. In instant yeast, it really doesn't matter. But with active dry yeast, I like to mix it in before I pour the water in. Now, whether or not that's a real thing, it's just something I was taught and I can't help myself. Okay, my yeast is ready. It's ready to play. It's only been about 5 minutes and it's already pretty foamy. So I'm going to pour it straight into the flour mixture. Now, either using a Danish whisk, which I happen to have, or a wooden spoon, you're going to mix that until all the flour has been absorbed by the water. If you have to get in there with your hands, you can do that too. And I always get yelled at on social media for my rings, so let me take those off because I'm going to get in there with my hands. And my hair, I know. I have hair. What am I going to do? When you're done mixing, it should look like this. There's no kneading involved. You cover it and let it double in size for 2 hours in a warm place. And like I said in my videos, I use my oven with the light on, oven off. On to the next step. It's been about an hour that the bread has been rising. And so now it's time to turn your oven on to 500 degrees Fahrenheit and put your Dutch oven, if you're using one, in the oven. If you don't have a Dutch oven, you can still bake this bread on a hot pizza stone or on a hot baking sheet that you preheat in the oven. So I'm going to leave this in the oven at 500 degrees for about an hour because the rise has about another hour left. It's been about a half hour that the Dutch oven has been in the oven. So now I'm going to form my bread and let it sit for 30 minutes while the Dutch oven is heating. So I'm going to flour my surface. You want to flour it pretty well, not too much flour, but enough for it not to stick. And I'm going to use this plastic dough scraper just to get it out of the bowl. Once you have it out of the bowl, you want to fold it onto itself from the top towards the middle, from the middle towards the top. Turn it and do the same with the sides. And you want to flip it over and just form a nice tight ball. Now I'm going to place it onto a parchment paper And if you want to add some additional flavor, you can add a little bit of cornmeal to the bottom of the parchment paper. Pick up your loaf, place it on top of the cornmeal. And now in the same bowl you used to rise your dough, you're going to cover it and let it sit for 30 minutes while the Dutch oven is heating. It's been 30 minutes and now I'm going to score the top of the bread just with a cross with a bread lamb. The scoring helps the bread expand in the oven, and you don't want to get fancy here. You just want to make a nice, about ½ inch deep cut. This is really hot, so be careful, you can burn yourself. Take the top off, and now you're going to slowly lower the bread into the hot Dutch oven. And something that I learned in sourdough baking is to spray the inside of the Dutch oven with water to create a steam effect to help the oven spring. If you're not using a Dutch oven, you either want to throw some ice cubes inside the oven or spray the walls of the oven and then shut the door quickly. Into the oven for 30 minutes covered and 15 minutes uncovered at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. It's out of the oven and it's beautiful. It's so hot. I'm going to show you what it looks like. Look at that. With minimal effort, with no stand mixer, you can make this bread. Let's listen to the crust. Now let's cut it and see what it looks like inside. I think it's going to be beautiful. It's so soft and crusty on the outside. Coulis slice, butt slice, compliments to the cook. Get some butter on it. A little bit of salt. This is so easy. You can do it. I promise you. There's nothing like homemade bread.